So hi Natasha, hi Capucine, and I'm really pleased to be talking with you today about our International Women's Day theme this year of embracing equity. And it's really kind of you to give up your time so we can talk a little bit about what embracing equity means to us, and also how being a woman in law has changed over the last 2, 10, 20, maybe 30 years. And just get some different perspectives on where it's going, where we think it's going, where we hope it might go in the future. So I mean, Capucine, what do you think? How do you think that women's experience in the law today compares with maybe 30 years ago?
So I'm still fairly baby when it comes to my legal career. I only qualified a year and a half ago now, so I'm still fairly junior when it comes to the legal profession. But I think, well, for one thing, there are definitely more women in the law generally. There are far more senior women, far more prominent senior women, senior court, Supreme Court justices, etc., etc. And so, from that respect, as a junior woman, I have far more female role models at every level than I think someone 10, 20, 30 years ago probably would have had. So that is probably the biggest change over the last 30 years, I would guess. That is, yeah.
How about you, Natasha? What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's really interesting, isn't it? Because we've recently celebrated 100 years of women in law. And as I understand it, not very much happened for the first 60 years of that. So actually, when we think about the last 30 years, that's where we've really seen the change. And actually, we've seen such change that now we have more female lawyers coming into the profession. So 60% of trainee lawyers are female rather than male. So really substantial change there, although of course we've not necessarily seeing that change filter through to the senior levels within law firms, and of course we can come on to talk about that later. But I mean, in terms of my journey into law, I actually started off as a recruiter, but from a gender specific perspective, I remember that anyone looking for part-time working, flexible working, anyone that had taken a career break, they didn't even make it onto the database. And so fast forward to now, and I think really it's been the impact of the gender pay gap regulations actually that have really made businesses and law firms engage in what their gender pay gap looks like, and thinking about actually how do we actively try and address these challenges, that we've seen a change. And if you look at how recruiters are approached now, businesses are going to them and saying, we want diverse panels, and we need candidates that have got something different. We'll look at people who have taken a career break. We're open to flexible working. And so I think in the last 10 years where I've been in law, I've seen such a substantial change, and it really is encouraging. How about you, Jane?
Well, as probably the most senior person here in age and experience, there's a real difference to 30 years ago. It's always difficult to say whether the law's changed or whether I've just got older within it. But I mean, certainly we've gone from the automatic assumption being this is a man's world. I think it still is a man's world. I think that's still something we haven't quite got over. But there's no longer the assumption that you have to dress a certain way. You don't have to wear like the female equivalent of the grey suit with the double cuff shirt and the collar and the silk knots that certainly some people of an age will remember. That was the uniform as you were a trainee. You had to wear heels, you had to wear tights in the office, but at the same time you were expected to kind of dress like a man and be part of that club, but you also had to be feminine, so you weren't allowed to wear trousers. You were encouraged to wear high heels, although I got told off for wearing pink heels to court with a black trouser suit once, even though no one could see them. I mean, it was so pointless, but that's dress codes for you. But I agree with you, Capucine, there are certainly more female role models. I think there are also more prominent allies. I think there are more prominent men who have realised that actually in order to change, it's not just about women fighting harder. We need allies, we need mentors and sponsors, male and female, but where the most senior people are male, then they're automatically going to become the mentors and the sponsors. So that, I think, has definitely changed. I think there's also fewer people who try and tell you what you can and can't do. I certainly remember being, an 18-year-old doing work experience and with a barrister in a criminal trial, and being told I couldn't read some of the material to do with our particular, what our particular client had been accused of, because, I was a girl and it wasn't really appropriate. It was bad language, or it was some sort of sexual offence, and we weren't allowed to do that. But we were allowed to go out and join business development activities because they needed a skirt there, and it would be wrong to just have men. It was an interesting idea of gender balance. I also think, like you said, Natasha, there's definitely less of that kind of casual misogyny, less of that, you must get back in the kitchen, or, what are you doing out here? So, and maybe that's also another thing that's changed, that traditional business development has moved on. There is still that kind of male networking that goes on, but I think there's also room for female networking, particularly in the way that a lot of our clients are women. And actually, a lot of them will want to network and do business development in a different way. And I think that's okay. I think there is still room for both genders, so long as the automatic assumption is that we have to spend the day, playing golf or drinking beer, or whatever the sort of fixed play used to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I certainly remember when I came into the legal profession, I felt as though the hierarchies were so distinct within a law firm, and the role of a female lawyer within that. And certainly when you come in at a junior level, the expectation is how you would operate and how you would act was quite clear. And the misogyny, the harassment, the discrimination, all of that, I think that some of that was just part and parcel of being a woman in the working world, and that for years that had been the expectation, that you would just deal with it and you don't really talk about it. And I think we've seen a great deal of change even in the last kind of 5 years or so with the impact of the Me Too movement. And so now people are talking about these things, acknowledging that perhaps they are obstacles actually to progression within businesses and firms. And now we're starting to see things being done about things when they're happening. But also, I just think that things have changed, and it's much fairer and it's much more normal.
Well, let's hope so. I think there's certainly a feeling that it ought to be fairer and it ought to be normal, but we still got to keep working. I mean, just on that, we've been talking about the things that we think have changed over the years, but it's we're learning all the time. Has anyone got something that it took you a really long time to learn, bearing in mind, Kathleen, the length of your career, but maybe something that you assumed, an assumption that you made, or a myth that you heard that's been busted, and can maybe help others?
One that comes to mind, and I think it's probably more of a problem for women generally, is a lack of confidence, and therefore you're potentially more afraid to ask for help because you don't want to seem like you don't know, or you don't want to come across as less aware or with less knowledge, when sometimes it can just be that someone has done that question of law or has dealt with that fact pattern recently. And so I think it's very easy to not want to ask for help because you don't want to seem less than, or like less, when actually it's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of, well, one, you actually like your colleagues and get on with them and aren't afraid of your work environment, but also it's an acknowledgement that everyone has different levels of knowledge on different areas, and that's not a bad thing. And so I think it's just that general willingness from everyone to help out, rather than being, this is my client and so I'm just going to deal with them and I'm not going to ask anyone else for help on this, etc., etc. So I think that's the biggest myth or not myth, but thing to learn and to keep in mind at all times, is just you can ask for help and it's okay.
And this idea that you're not just asking for help because you're one gender or another, or you're not behaving in this way because you are a woman or because you're a man. We are who we are. And I think it's that, maybe it's a stereotype that I think maybe we've lost the gender stereotype.
Hopefully.
I think so. How about you, Natasha?
Yeah, I mean, I think mine is along similar lines, really. I think it was a bit of a revelation for me that you could focus on your strengths and really develop those areas, and that's much likely to be more impactful than actually focusing on your weaknesses. And certainly that's something that I'm can be pretty bad for doing, and that actually yeah, it's just not as helpful, really, is it? And I think in line with you, Cappuccino, I mean, understanding that people at a senior level in the business still see themselves as learning, and that they're still developing themselves, because often you look up and you think everybody else is the kind of finished article, and that can make everybody else seem as though they kind of know what they're doing and they don't need any kind of support, and make it much more difficult to ask for help, as you say.
Yeah, I think there's a lot more openness about generally the how people are thinking and feeling about work, and we can have conversations about how we've all experienced our careers in different ways. But people coming out and saying, actually, I had real imposter syndrome, I didn't feel like I deserved to be there, and you hear that from really senior level people who are saying they've taken that next step up, and they, you know, they still feel like they don't know what they're doing, or maybe they feel even more that they don't know what they're doing, when we all look at them and we know they deserve to be there. For, you know, because they're brilliant and they, you know, they've worked really hard. And I think that's the other thing, you don't look and automatically say there's, you know, I remember it being said about somebody I trained with who was a very, very successful corporate lawyer, and she became a partner very quickly in a big US firm. And one of our male cohort said to me, you know, years later, he said, gosh, she had such sharp elbows. And I thought, you're a partner in corporate, you know, corporate partner in another really successful role in a US law firm. She's basically matched you step by step on your career, and you're calling her sharp-elbowed. You know, what were you, just lucky, or are you ambitious? And that's something that we should all, you know, we should all praise. I think the other thing that I've learned over the years, and maybe this ties in with this same idea, like we all need to know everything all the time, is this idea that you should have a career totally mapped out, particularly as a woman, and particularly if you want to have a family, for example. You know, that you should have this idea of, you know, we train, we qualify, we get our job, we have our career progression mapped out, and it's, you know, at this stage I am going to stop and I'm going to have some children, or one child, or I'm going to take time out to adopt, or whatever it is, and I'm going to take this time out from work, and then I will go back into work and I will carry on in this very fixed pattern, and I can plan everything around it. And it doesn't happen like that. And I think the idea that we have, maybe it's because we have more role models than we used to, that you can look and you say there's no one size fits all, and in order to be successful as a woman in, you know, in law, in any career, you don't have to do it a particular way. And the most successful women I've met over my career have been ones who've done it slightly differently, but they haven't done it on purpose necessarily. That's just how it's happened, and they've still managed to get to the same place. But I think this idea that we then start to sort of put pressure on ourselves or beat ourselves up because these things aren't happening in the same way, and we're not being promoted at the same time, or we're taking different roles, you know, that is just a myth. Anyone who says they had it planned out is lying, as far as I can see, or just incredibly lucky.
Yeah, I think you've hit a really important point there around the role models, and I think that really is the essence of why it's so important to have diversity of talent at the top, because actually then you have diversity of role models and it can inspire everybody else coming up through the chain. And I think it has been a genuine obstacle to women progressing through law firms, where actually traditionally these have been male dominated environments, and it's difficult for women then to see themselves in those senior roles. And historically, perhaps they felt, I need to essentially emulate those male characteristics, and I need to be able to operate in exactly the same way. And that can present additional challenges for those coming up through the ranks, because it feels as though it's either or. Either I can fit myself into this male dominated environment, or I can't and I have to leave. And I think that the challenge now that law firms are looking to address is to try and make the business a much more inclusive environment, where both men and women, everybody can feel that this is a place that they can succeed and excel and develop their careers.
Yeah, and we see more and more men who are openly taking on the role. We're talking about women changing over the years and how things have changed for women, but actually because men have changed as well over the years and are more open to saying, actually, I've got to do the nursery run, or I'm picking the kids up from school today, or I've got this responsibility or that responsibility that is not fee earning. We're all more prepared to say, well, that's fine. We have a life outside work, and sometimes the two cross over and intermingle, and that's okay as well. And in the same way that we have female role models who are working in a different way and openly working in a different way, we have male allies who are also working in that different way, and we share the burden. Now, some careers allow for that, some don't, but certainly my husband does a lot of the parenting, a lot of the childcare. Does it mean to stop me thinking about what child needs what in school, and making sure their shoes are polished on a Monday morning, or finding out, as I did this morning, that even though he was looking after them for some of the weekend, one of them hadn't done their homework. That still seems to fall back on me, but at least during the working day I can say, do you know what, I will do this day, you can do this day, and I can concentrate on work without being torn in different directions.